My professor told me my analysis of the novel was wrong, but I'm the author. Okay, so picture this, I was trying to disappear. I was sitting in the very back row of Professor Whitmore's contemporary literature class, blending into the buzzing fluorescent lights and the smell of old coffee. But here's the kicker, 20 students in that room were flipping through copies of The Drowning Season, my novel. The one that won the National Book Award 3 years ago. Little did I know, this class was about to become an absolute battlefield where I'd have to fight for the very soul of my own story. I was there as Diana Ashford, my real name, craving anonymity after the whirlwind of book tours and constant public dissection. I just wanted to be a student again, to hear what people really thought about my work when they didn't know the author was in the room. Professor Whitmore, supposedly a leading expert, was about to deliver his interpretation, and I was genuinely curious. That curiosity? It nearly cost me everything. He stood at the front, holding my book like it was evidence in a crime scene. What Mitchell fails to understand about her own protagonist, he declared with utter confidence, is that Ella Lehner's drowning obsession isn't about trauma. It's about feminine hysteria. My pen froze. Hysteria? My heart sank. I'd spent 2 years crafting Ella Lehner's character, basing her fear of water on my own near drowning at age 12. Every single scene was meticulously built to show how trauma reshapes your entire world. He paced, getting into his rhythm. The author clearly intended this as a metaphor for female weakness, the inability to overcome irrational fears. It's almost Freudian in its simplicity. A girl in the front dared to suggest, maybe the water symbolizes Ella Lehner's attempt to reclaim her power? Whitmore laughed. An actual, dismissive laugh. That's a very undergraduate reading, Melissa. We're past surface-level interpretations here. That's when I raised my hand. My heart was pounding so hard I swore everyone could hear it. Whitmore, probably surprised the quiet back row student was speaking, nodded. Yes, Diana? I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. What if the drowning obsession is actually about PTSD? The text specifically mentions Ella Lehner's childhood incident in Chapter 4, and throughout the book, her reactions align with trauma responses, rather than hysteria. His expression shifted in an instant, from mild interest to outright condescension. He set the book down, crossed his arms. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're conflating the character's backstory with the author's thematic intent. Mitchell herself has said in interviews that the book is about the human condition, not some personal trauma diary. He was quoting my own interview, the one a magazine had completely twisted. I'd actually said it explores how personal trauma is part of the human condition, but they'd edited it to sound pretentious and vague. But what if the interview was misrepresented? I pushed back, trying to keep my tone academic. If you look at the narrative structure, every water scene is triggered by specific sensory details that mirror trauma flashbacks. That's not hysteria. That's clinically accurate PTSD representation. He actually rolled his eyes. The classroom went dead silent. He walked closer to my desk, and I could feel the other students shifting uncomfortably. Diana, he said, his voice dripping with superiority, I've been teaching this novel for 2 years. I've published 3 papers on Mitchell's work. I've interviewed her twice for academic journals. I think I understand her intentions better than a first-semester graduate student who's reading the book for the first time. My face burned. I knew I should just drop it, but something inside me snapped. What if you're wrong about what the author intended? Whitmore's jaw tightened. I'm not wrong. Mitchell is a talented writer, but like many young female authors, she doesn't fully grasp the literary traditions she's working within. That's not an insult. It's an observation. The text speaks for itself, regardless of what the author thinks she meant. Priya, the girl next to me, whispered, just let it go. He's like this with everyone. But I couldn't. This man was butchering my book, telling students that my carefully crafted representation of trauma was actually about female weakness and hysteria. He was using my own work to reinforce the exact stereotypes I'd fought against. He moved back to the front, pulled up a slide. Let's look at Chapter 12, where Ella Lehner refuses to get in the boat. Mitchell writes the scene with such melodrama, such excessive emotional reaction that it borders on parody. A stronger writer would have shown restraint. He read a passage aloud in a mocking tone, and my chest constricted with anger. That chapter had taken me 6 months to write. Rewritten 43 times. I'd poured my soul into capturing the exact feeling of panic, the body's betrayal, the shame of being triggered. After class, I sat in my car, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called my agent, Beth. Her voice was bright, oblivious. Diana, how's grad school? I unleashed everything, words tumbling out about Whitmore's condescension, his twisted interpretations. Beth was quiet, then said, Diana, honey, this is why I told you going back to school under a different name was a bad idea. You can't control how people interpret your work, even when they're wrong. I knew she was right, but it didn't lessen the sting. She suggested revealing my identity or transferring, but both felt like giving up. I'd paid for this semester. I'd earned my place. I wasn't letting his ego drive me out. That evening, I spread out my original manuscript notes, character sketches, trauma research, therapist interviews, my own journal entries about the near-drowning. I systematically photographed every page, building a digital file of undeniable evidence. When my cat Gatsby knocked over coffee, blurring some old notes, I didn't panic. The photos were safe. I drafted an email to the department chair, then deleted it 4 times. How do you prove you're the author without sounding completely insane? Next class, Whitmore announced group presentations. I was assigned Chapter 18, Ella Laner's climactic confrontation with her fear. My group included Priya, Austin, who never spoke, and Kayla, who treated every class like a TED Talk audition. In the library, Kayla immediately took charge. Priya mumbled about slides. That left me with analyzing the text. Perfect. I spent the next week dissecting my own writing, pulling out every deliberate choice, every callback, every metaphor. I wrote a 15-page analysis that basically demolished Whitmore's entire interpretation. When we met to combine sections, Kayla read my analysis and frowned. This is really good, Diana, but it contradicts everything Professor Whitmore has been teaching us. He's going to think we weren't paying attention. She started red pen my explanations of trauma responses, my careful documentation of the text. Priya gave me a sympathetic look. Austin was glued to his phone. I took a deep breath. What if Whitmore's framework is wrong? What if there's evidence that the author intended something completely different? Kayla laughed. Diana, no offense, but you're not going to out-analyze a professor who's literally published books on this stuff. We need to give him what he wants if we want a good grade. She wasn't wrong about the grade, but everything in me rebelled against presenting a false interpretation of my own work just to appease his ego. That night, I drove to the bookstore where I'd done my first reading for the drowning season years ago. Margaret, the owner, had been an early supporter. She listened intently to my story. I've sold over 300 copies of this book, Diana. I've heard you read from it. That professor doesn't know what he's talking about. She showed me her dog-eared copy, full of margin notes from a book club interpretations far closer to my intent than anything Whitmore had spouted. Margaret even offered to write a letter to the university. But I wasn't ready for that nuclear option. Not yet. I wanted to try one more time, through the work itself, through undeniable textual evidence. The morning of the presentation, I woke at 5 a.m., heart pounding. I rehearsed my part, trying to sound confident, academic, not desperate. Beth texted, "Remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." But I did. At least to myself. I wanted the analysis to stand alone, so airtight that Whitmore would have to admit he was wrong. The presentation started smoothly. Kayla delivered her intro perfectly. Priya presented the critical reception, carefully weaving in reviews that subtly challenged Whitmore's views. Then it was my turn. I pulled up my slides, walking through the textual analysis, showing how Ella Laner's responses matched clinical PTSD descriptions, how the narrative mimicked traumatic memory. I watched Whitmore's expression change, his arms crossed tighter, his jaw clenched. When I finished, a long pause hung in the air. Kayla quickly tried to transition. But Whitmore held up his hand. "Wait, Diana, are you suggesting that I've been teaching this novel incorrectly for 2 years?" His voice was sharp. The whole class held its breath. I met his gaze. "I'm suggesting there's textual evidence for an alternative interpretation that aligns more closely with trauma theory than with concepts of hysteria." He stood up, walked to the front of the room, positioning himself directly in front of my group. This is exactly the problem with contemporary literary criticism. Students think they can cherry-pick quotes and force a reading that suits their political agenda rather than engaging with what the author actually wrote. He turned to the class. Mitchell's novel is clearly working within a tradition of feminine Gothic literature. To reduce it to a simple trauma narrative is to miss the entire point. My hands curled into fists. But what if the author has explicitly stated that the book is based on her own trauma? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Authors are notoriously unreliable narrators of their own work. Death of the author, Diana. I'm surprised you haven't encountered that concept yet. He turned back to the class, dismissing me completely, dismantling my analysis piece by piece. My groupmates stared at their shoes. After class, Priya pulled me aside. "That took guts, but you know he's going to tank our grade now, right?" Kayla chimed in, "I warned you, Diana. Now we're all going to suffer for it." 2 days later, our grade was posted, C-. The comment failed to engage with the text on a sophisticated level, instead relying on reductive psychological readings that missed the literary complexity of Mitchell's work. I stared at that grade, feeling a fierce mix of anger and vindication. The anger won. I typed a new email, subject, meeting request. If he wanted to discuss sophisticated textual analysis, I'd give him more than he bargained for. Whitmore's office was exactly as you'd imagine, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a massive wooden desk, a window overlooking the quad. He gestured to a small chair opposite his desk, taking his larger leather one, instantly putting me in the subordinate position. Diana, I appreciate your passion, but your presentation revealed some fundamental misunderstandings. He pulled out my slides, red ink scrawled everywhere. You're confusing biographical criticism with textual analysis. I let him talk, watching him circle, underline, and add sarcastic comments to my meticulously researched work. When he finally paused, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. What if I could show you the author's original notes? Her research materials, character sketches, explicit statements about her intentions? He leaned back with a patronizing smile. Diana, even if you had those materials, they wouldn't change the fundamental analysis. The text exists independently of the author's intentions. I opened the folder. Spread across his desk, character sketches with PTSD notes, research papers on trauma, excerpts from my own journal that directly paralleled scenes in the book. He glanced at them with vague interest. These are fascinating fabrications, Diana. But surely you understand I can't take anonymous documents at face value. Anyone could type up fake author notes. His dismissiveness was so absolute, so unshakable, that something shifted inside me. I pulled out my phone, scrolling to emails from my publisher, Beth, early readers. I turned the phone toward him, showing an email chain about Ella Lehner's character development dated 2 years before publication. He squinted. Email addresses can be spoofed. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but making up evidence isn't going to change your grade. I stood up, my legs shaky, but my voice steady. I'm not making anything up, Professor Whitmore. The words hung in the air. I'm Dia Mitchell. I wrote The Drowning Season, and you've been teaching it wrong for 2 years. For the first time since I'd walked in, he looked uncertain. He glanced at the documents, then my face, then my phone. That's quite a claim. His confidence wavered. Dia Mitchell is a pseudonym, obviously, but her real name is. He trailed off, pulling out his phone, Googling me. I watched the realization hit him in stages, confusion, recognition, then pure panic. His face went pale as he compared my face to book jacket photos where I'd worn more makeup. But you enrolled as Diana Ashford. You never said, he was stammering. Why would you hide your identity? This is highly irregular. I gathered my documents, sliding them back into my folder with deliberate slowness. I enrolled under my legal name because I wanted to study literature without the baggage of being a published author. I wanted honest feedback, genuine discussion. I didn't expect my professor to spend weeks teaching my book as an example of female weakness and hysteria when it's actually about trauma recovery. Whitmore stood, running a hand through his hair, looking around his office like the walls might offer escape. I need to verify this. You understand? I can't just take your word for it. I pulled out my driver's license and my author ID card from the National Book Foundation, laying them on his desk. Diana Ashford Mitchell, in black and white. He picked up the ID card with shaking hands, studying it, then my face. I could see him mentally replaying every condescending comment, every dismissal. I didn't know, he finally whispered. You should have told me. Why? I asked, surprised by the calm in my voice. So you could treat my interpretation as valid only because of who I am, rather than because of the textual evidence? The analysis I presented was solid regardless of my identity. He sank back into his chair, trying to find some way to maintain his authority. Be that as it may, the principle of death of the author still stands. Your intentions, while interesting, don't override the text itself or how readers and scholars interpret it. I almost laughed at his audacity. Even now, he was doubling down. Professor Whitmore, you didn't just interpret my book differently. You taught it as something it fundamentally isn't. You told students Ella Lehner's trauma was hysteria, that her recovery arc was weakness. You used my work to reinforce harmful stereotypes about women and mental health. He flinched. That's your subjective reading of my teaching. Literary criticism involves multiple perspectives. I leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. It's not subjective when you're factually wrong about what happens in the text. Ella Lehner doesn't give in to hysteria in chapter 12. She has a panic attack triggered by specific sensory details I carefully planted. That's not interpretation. That's reading comprehension. His face flushed red, anger replacing his shock. I don't appreciate your tone, Miss Mitchell. Regardless of your identity, you're still a student, and you will show me the respect that position demands. I straightened up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. I'll show you the same respect you showed my work and my analysis. I'm filing a formal complaint with the department chair about your teaching methods and your grading bias. That C- our group received was retaliation for challenging your interpretation, and we both know it. He stood abruptly, his chair hitting the bookshelf. You're making a serious accusation. Do you have any proof of bias? I pulled out my phone again. As a matter of fact, I do. I opened my recording app. I've been recording every class session since week 3. The color drained from his face as I played snippets, his voice, clearly stating Mitchell doesn't understand her own protagonist, exemplifies female weakness. Every condescending comment, every dismissal. When I stopped, the office was dead silent. You can't record classes without permission. There are privacy laws. His voice was desperate. I smiled, with no warmth. Actually, this is a one-party consent state. I'm legally allowed to record any conversation I'm part of. These recordings will be included in my formal complaint, along with documentation of how you graded my group's presentation compared to others. He sank back down. I watched him do the math, published author, recordings, retaliatory grading. His academic reputation was about to shatter. What do you want? He asked, his professorial authority completely gone. He looked small. I considered carefully. I want you to correct your teaching. I want you to apologize to the class for misrepresenting the book. I want our group's grade reviewed by an impartial faculty member. And I want you to understand that death of the author doesn't mean you get to make up whatever interpretation you want and call it scholarship. He opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. Or I can take these recordings public. I can write an essay about how one of the country's leading literature professors spent 2 years teaching my National Book Award-winning novel as an example of female hysteria. How do you think that would play in the current academic climate? His jaw clenched. He nodded slowly. I'll need time to review my materials, to reconsider my interpretation in light of this new information. The grudging tone told me he still thought he was right, just caught. I left his office and walked straight to the department chair's suite. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo was eating salad at her desk. Miss Ashford, is everything all right? She asked, her expression shifting when she saw my face. It's actually Mitchell, Diana Ashford Mitchell, and I need to file a formal complaint against Professor Whitmore. I spent the next hour telling her everything, showing her my ID, playing the recordings. Dr. Okonkwo listened, taking notes, her expression growing serious. When I finished, she looked at me with a mix of sympathy and frustration. Why didn't you disclose your identity when you enrolled? This whole situation could have been avoided. I'd expected it, but it still stung. With respect, Dr. Okonkwo, I shouldn't have to announce my credentials to receive fair treatment. My analysis was solid regardless of who I am. The problem isn't that I hid my identity. The problem is Professor Whitmore dismissed valid textual analysis because it came from a student he didn't respect. She nodded. You're right, of course. But you understand this puts the department in a difficult position. Professor Whitmore is tenured, well-published, and highly regarded. She trailed off, already calculating the political fallout. I played her another recording, Whitmore mocking a student's undergraduate reading, laughing at a suggestion of power reclamation. He's not just wrong about my book. He's creating a hostile learning environment for any student who dares to disagree with him. How many other students has he dismissed? How many valid interpretations has he shut down? Dr. Okonkwo's expression hardened. I'll need to keep these recordings for the investigation. I'll need a formal statement detailing everything. She paused. I need to warn you that filing this complaint will likely become public knowledge. Your identity as D.A. Mitchell will be revealed, possibly to the media. Are you prepared for that? I thought about it. My desire for privacy against my responsibility to other students. I'm prepared, I said. This isn't just about me anymore. That evening, Gatsby purring on my lap, I drafted the complaint. 12 pages detailing every incident, every recording. My phone buzzed with texts from Priya, who'd heard the gossip. Is it true you're D.A. Mitchell? The whole program is freaking out. I sent back a simple yes and turned off my phone. At midnight, I submitted it all. Relieved. Terrified. No taking it back. The next morning, my phone exploded. Someone leaked the story to the campus paper. By noon, National Book Award winner secretly enrolled in grad program, professor taught her book wrong for 2 years, was trending on literary Twitter. Beth called 7 times. When I finally answered, she was laughing so hard she could barely speak. Diana, this is insane. This is the best book publicity money can't buy. My book sales jumped 30% in a single day. Publishers Weekly and NPR wanted interviews. Everyone wanted to hear about the author who'd gone undercover and exposed a professor. Whitmore emailed me at 3 a.m. Miss Mitchell, I think we can resolve this amicably without involving the media. Perhaps we could discuss revising your grade and issuing a private apology to your group. There's no need for this to become a public spectacle that damages both our reputations. I forwarded it to Dr. Okonkwo without responding. An hour later, the university released a statement. Whitmore was on administrative leave pending review. The English department's phones were jammed. Other students came forward with their own stories of Whitmore's dismissiveness. The investigation grew beyond my complaint. 3 days later, I was in an NPR studio. I explained it wasn't about author intent versus reader interpretation, it was about a professor teaching factually incorrect information and creating a hostile environment. If Professor Whitmore had simply offered a different interpretation, that would be fine. But he taught my trauma narrative as hysteria, mocked students who saw the PTSD themes, and graded us down for presenting textual evidence that contradicted his view. That's not interpretation. That's ideological bias masquerading as scholarship. The interview aired, sparking heated debates across the country. The literary world was divided, and I was at the center of it, whether I wanted to be or not. A week into the investigation, Dr. Okonkwo called me in again. She looked exhausted. The review committee has finished their preliminary findings. She handed me a thick folder. We found evidence of systematic bias. Multiple students reported being penalized. His published papers on your novel contain factual errors about the text itself. She paused. He's being formally reprimanded, required to undergo training, his courses monitored, and he's been removed from teaching graduate seminars for the next year. My stomach dropped. That's it? After everything, he just gets a slap on the wrist? Dr. Okonkwo sighed. Tenure is powerful, Miss Mitchell. The evidence, while concerning, doesn't rise to termination. However, she pulled out another document. Your group's grade has been changed to an A. Professor Whitmore has been required to issue a formal apology to your group and to revise his course materials on your novel. It wasn't enough. Not really. But it was something. More than I'd expected when I first heard him call my protagonist hysterical. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, sincere. Your complaint has already changed our department. We're implementing new policies, anonymous reporting channels, reviewing our curriculum. What you did took courage, and it's making a real difference. I wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I felt tired. The semester ended in a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. Students stopped me on campus, some treating me like a hero, others like I'd betrayed an academic code. The English department threw an awkward reception for me. Whitmore was absent, consulting with lawyers. Beth called with more news. A literary magazine wanted an essay version of what happened, offering $15,000 and a cover feature. I spent a week writing it, not just the drama, but the larger issues, how we teach literature, how we value interpretation, who gets taken seriously. The essay sparked another national conversation. This time, I felt more in control of the narrative. I wasn't just the wronged author. I was making an argument. Universities started reaching out. I gave talks about author intent, teaching methodology. I found myself in front of rooms full of students and professors debating the Mitchell case. Some defended Whitmore. Others saw it as I did, not about control, but about textual accuracy and academic integrity. The conversations were messy, uncomfortable, and exactly what literature departments needed. In April, an unexpected email from Professor Whitmore. Dear Miss Mitchell, I hope this message finds you well. I must admit, re-evaluating my approach to your novel. While I still maintain that death of the author is a valid critical framework, I can acknowledge that I allowed my theoretical commitments to override careful reading of the text itself. You are correct that Ella Lehner's trauma is clearly established. I was wrong to dismiss your analysis, and I was especially wrong to grade your group's presentation as I did. This is not easy for me to admit, but scholarship requires intellectual honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable. He asked to meet for coffee. As colleagues. I stared at the email. We met at an off-campus cafe. He looked different, without the armor of his professor persona, older, more uncertain, wearing a cardigan. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with intense focus. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About my teaching, my assumptions, my ego. He looked up, and I saw genuine remorse. I convinced myself that I understood your work better than you did. That was arrogant and frankly lazy scholarship. He continued, I've been rereading The Drowning Season without my theoretical framework, just letting the text speak for itself. You're right about the trauma narrative. It's there in every chapter, carefully constructed and clinically accurate. I missed it because I was looking for something more complicated, more literary, when the truth was right there on the page. We talked for 2 hours. It was the conversation I'd wanted all semester. He asked about my writing process, really listened, shared his evolving thoughts. He admitted his published papers would need corrections, that he'd write a follow-up piece. I want to use this as a teaching moment, he said, not just for my students, but for other scholars. We get so attached to our interpretations that we stop seeing what's actually there. It wasn't a complete redemption arc, but it was a start. A genuine attempt to learn. When we parted, he shook my hand. Your book deserved better than my reading of it. Thank you for holding me accountable, even though I made it incredibly difficult. I walked back to my car, feeling something shift. Not quite forgiveness, but understanding. Growth is messy. That fall, the university invited me to give a lecture. I stood in front of a packed auditorium, talking about the drowning season, about Ella Laner's journey, about the importance of accurate portrayals of mental health. But I also talked about what I'd learned from Whitmore, humility, the difference between interpretation and misrepresentation, and creating educational spaces where disagreement is welcomed, but evidence still matters. Authors don't get to control how readers experience their work, I said. But readers and scholars have a responsibility to engage with what's actually on the page before building their theories. There's a balance between honoring author intent and allowing for multiple interpretations. Finding that balance requires intellectual honesty, careful reading, and a willingness to be wrong. A young woman approached me after, clutching my book. Miss Mitchell, I was in Professor Whitmore's class last year. I disagreed with him, but I was too scared to speak up. Seeing what you did made me realize I don't have to accept every authority figure's opinion as fact. She was working on her own novel about anxiety. Your book showed me it could be powerful. As she walked away, I realized this was why it all mattered. Not just correcting one professor, but showing other students, other writers, that their experiences were valid and worth defending. 6 months later, I defended my master's thesis. Whitmore wasn't on my committee, but he attended the public portion, asking a thoughtful question about personal experience and literary craft. After I passed, he congratulated me. I'm teaching your book again next semester, he said. But this time, I'm leading with the trauma narrative. And I'm bringing in guest speakers who work in trauma psychology. It was strange to hear, but satisfying. Future students would get a more accurate, respectful reading of Ella Laner's journey. My agent called a week after graduation. Diana, your sales have tripled. The drowning season is getting a new printing, and your publisher wants to know when the next book is coming. I'd been so focused on the academic drama that I hadn't written anything new in months. But that evening, sitting at my desk, a blank document on screen, words finally started to flow. This next book would be different, shaped by everything I'd learned about standing up for yourself, about the messy process of change, about how sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never expected to fight. The story of Professor Whitmore still comes up sometimes. People ask if I regret going public. If I think I was too harsh. My answer is always the same: I did what I needed to do. Could it have been handled more quietly? Maybe. But quiet conversations behind closed doors don't create systemic change. Sometimes, you have to make noise to make a difference, even when that noise is uncomfortable and messy and risks your own reputation. Looking back now, I'm proud of the scared student who raised her hand in that classroom. I'm proud of the person who kept pushing when it would have been easier to walk away. And I'm proud of the writer who understood that defending your work isn't about ego, it's about integrity.